From Sattva Knowledge Institute, this is Decoding Impact, the podcast where we apply systems thinking in conversation with extraordinary experts to understand what it truly takes to scale solutions in the social sector. Decoding Impact is hosted by Ratish Balakrishnan, a co-founder and managing partner at Sattva. Welcome to today's episode.
Small and marginal farmers comprise 85% of all the farmers in India. Farmer producer organizations have the potential to address issues of bargaining power, credit taxes, farm inputs, and effective implementation of various government and private sector-led farm interventions. And this idea of farmer producer organizations is not new. It has been around for the last 20 years. Especially in the last few years, we've seen an exponential growth in the number of farmer producer organizations. However, farmer producer organizations is a land of the dwarfs in some sense. 50% of all the FPOs are actually in just 4 states. 5.4% of the FPOs in the ecosystem generate more than 1 crore in revenue. 13.4% of the FPOs have more than 10 lakhs paid up capital. And less than 4% of the FPOs are able to raise 15 lakhs within 5 years. And so a lot of what we see as farmer producer organizations are necessarily very small organizations today. And scale has been a very, very critical challenge. Across the board, it has been acknowledged that building and finding this capability has been a challenge. If you are looking to grow the income of farmers, it's necessary now to actually find ways to build capabilities of leaders and to build capabilities of farmer producer organizations. And our conversation today is actually going to be around what does it take to make it happen. And to help us with this conversation, we actually have an eminent speaker with us, Mr. Emmanuel Murray. He is currently working as a senior advisor at Caspian Equity, considered as one of the most passionate and knowledgeable experts in the FPO ecosystem, with over 39 years of rich and diverse experience across agriculture, rural credit and micro enterprises, including 5 years as a head of operation of an impact-focused NBFC with a portfolio of over 6 billion rupees. He is currently focusing on multiple focus areas, including how to help build a more resilient and emergent food and agri startup ecosystem. Mr. Murray, thank you so much for joining us. It's an honor and a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much for this opportunity given to me to speak about farmer producer organizations.
To just begin the conversation, Mr. Murray, I'd love to hear about your experiences over 39 years across both agriculture, but more specifically also with farmer producer organizations.
In the early days, farmer producer organizations, it was pioneered by institutions like Pradhan. They were the ones who piloted the policy around farmer producer organization and incubated these early institutions, FPOs. And while at Reserve Bank, the then principal of the bank and later on to be deputy governor, Mr. Khan, was the one who suggested to me that these were institutions worth studying. And the outcome of that study was a paper we published on farmer producer organizations and the need for banking finance to these institutions. And this, I think, was a pioneering piece of that time, and it's still widely quoted. And one of the first pieces of literature on this subject. And that is how I got inducted into this space. Later on, I, of course, went back to my parent organization, NABARD. And after a few years, NABARD decided that FPOs were institutions that they would like to launch and promote under their own programs. And of course, at that point of time, I was transiting out of NABARD, but I was consulted in the design of those projects, which were launched later on, and a large number of FPOs were promoted by NABARD. Now, because of my writings on this space, and also my field work, I became a kind of reference point for various people working in the FPO space, more as a consultant, as a speaker at conferences, as an advisor in several different avatars I used to be invited, and every opportunity to visit is also an opportunity to learn. And because I was going to these multiple institutions, I had a panoramic view of what was happening in this space. What happened next was that the FAO of India requested me to do a report on FPOs in India and the future prospects. So that became another opportunity where we could do some work on the FPO space, and this was presented before the Planning Commission. And in that way, my engagement with FPOs continued. And most recently, we were commissioned by GIZ to write a guidebook on financing FPOs. So that's been another recent assignment that we did at Caspian, which I led.
Thank you, sir. And it's interesting to see how across diverse organizations, be it the NABARD, be it your work with Caspian now, across other places as well, you've been able to look at this, this evolution of farmer producer organizations, but also this whole idea of access to credit to farmer producer organizations. And I specifically wanted to get your thoughts on this whole idea of capability of FPOs today to even absorb the capital that we are talking about them getting. What are your thoughts on the whole capability building conversation of farmer producer organizations?
Building institutions is a long-term activity. So it takes a lot of effort and time to build these. So 5 to 7 years maybe is the minimum that would happen. So our expectations of quick results is a little, I think, unfair on them. But moving from production to being a player in the market is a big shift that we expect FPOs to do. In this, I think the challenges, unlike, let's say, milk and others, which are commodities where aggregation is easier and linkages are possible, we have not networked these institutions. So FPOs were standalone institutions and were told to play in the market. And therefore, because they didn't have the prior experience of dealing with the market, it was a pretty new game for both those promoting FPOs as well as the farmers themselves in trying to handle this. And also because agricultural markets are, in a way, unstructured. Not every transaction happens in paper and is documented. And so informal markets exist in a very large way. And trying to have a formal institution to deal in an informal market is a game by itself, because there are a lot of things. Once you're a formal institution, you need paperwork, you need records, you need registrations, and all that is new. And the other guy on the other side with whom you're competing doesn't require all these things. So in spite of that, I think over a period of time, these institutions have been able to find a place for themselves. Let's talk about members of FPOs. If we tell them that this FPO can make a difference in your life, the farmer would be looking at how can he get a better deal than what alternative channels provide. That may not happen in the immediate sense. And would a farmer be willing to deal on a promise of something better in the future is a question. So a small farmer having a small marketable surplus, telling him the future will be great, but for the time being, you deal with us and we may not be able to give something better, is a difficult proposition to sell. In spite of which, I think many of these institutions have been able to make a space for themselves, turn the tables, and make a difference. So diverse commodities, dealing with markets which on the other side are unstructured, promoting institutions that are largely of NGO origin and therefore they themselves do not understand the markets. All these have been reasons why it has taken much longer than we would have liked for these institutions to mature.
This is a fantastic sort of insight, sir. And I want to break down, Mr. Murray, what you shared into actually 6 things that I picked up as reasons. And it'll be good to sort of go into some of the details here. The first thing that you mentioned is we have unrealistic expectations on the time it takes for any organization to mature. From being an idea to a set of people to a business to an organization, even in a regular private sector play is actually a very long journey. And perhaps we have a unrealistic expectation of the time frame. And we do know that 79% of farmer producer organizations are aged 3 years or less. So today we are still a very, very nascent sector and a market. And so maybe we should just give it more time. I think that's a very, very valid point. The second thing that you said, which is extremely important, is that the business of production is very different from the business of market engagement. Producers are focused on a set of unique challenges on their own. And this is only getting worse with climate change and everything. In addition to that, now we are expecting them to trade, understand markets, figure out pricing and so on. So the set of skill sets that we are talking about is actually very, very different. So are we even expecting them to have, this broad set of skill sets overall? I think the third point that you made, and I think this comes from your, experience as well, that an Amul or NDTV, it was a networked entity, as opposed to a set of independent organizations that are left to fend for themselves. We still don't have a networked entity of a mother FPO network, which then works in integrating these individual FPOs. So market negotiations, market frictions, just having critical mass, etc., is very, very hard. It's like having micro enterprises delivering to a massive value chain, in the manufacturing side. Fourth point you made is that even a very seasoned entrepreneur would struggle because the markets are so informal. So the rules of the game are not very set, and recently we know with the farm laws as well, the nature of engagement here, it has a lot of structural sort of issues and challenges and informality. And any entity, even the most seasoned entrepreneur, will struggle in being able to do this very effectively. And FPOs then, along with all the other challenges we are talking about, it is actually, going to be even harder. NGOs are enabling farmer producer organizations, and NGOs themselves are not market-facing organizations. So it is in some sense organizations that themselves have a more equitable focus than the market focus, guiding farmers who also don't have market focus. So the blind spots are getting compounded unless we get people who really truly talk the market language. And the last part of what you said, sir, is the fact that farmers don't have cash flow and access to a security net that allows them to play the long game. It's easier for big businesses to play the long game, saying, listen, for 3 years, I'm going to do this. 4th year, there is going to be value. Farmers are subsistence and they have to see value today. And really to get them and sell them the story that, listen, 4 years later, this is going to be incredibly helpful for you, is very, very hard to sell. I don't know if I've been able to capture some of the points that you made. I fully agree with you. And I think sometimes we underestimate cash flow as a critical challenge. We just sort of do it as a business model and say, okay, 5 years, it's okay. But, farmers are looking at cash flow and that's important. I wanted to take the second point you made first, sir, which is the fact that farmers are producers and the production-related challenges are very different or unique in themselves compared to the market engagement challenge. At the core of it, do you see that as a skill set we can actually build in people? And also it'll be great, as you said, some FPOs have also been able to, despite all of these challenges, some FPOs have succeeded. So it'll be great to hear stories from you on people who have done this well. And what are ways in which we can bring this production and market engagement sort of skills together? Would be great to hear.
Particularly on the last one, you say keep 10% of need to be paid as equity in the company. Doesn't work for small farmers because what they get on hand is also very small. So how do we build equity in these institutions is also a challenge that I think keeps them small. On the input side, there is enough being done by several other players. So therefore, where FPOs have tried to start with inputs, they haven't been able to. They may be able to build a top line, but they haven't been able to very successfully build businesses. So being just an input supplier may not really work for an FPO in the long run. So the alternative is to begin to be a player on the market side. And that is where you need to identify how you could be different from others, or you could gain a foothold in the market, which is already pretty crowded with traders. So we have an FPO called Chetna Organic. Again, I think widely written about. But what they have been able to do is to identify markets for organic cotton globally, and then start building a production base in India. Because of weather and other factors, including low rainfall area, soil conditions, there are very few countries in the world that can grow cotton on the scale that we in India can grow. And we are going to be the major global suppliers for organic cotton in the years to come also. And this institution was able to build a large production base, that too in multiple states, Telangana, Maharashtra, and Orissa. That is also important because weather conditions vary across these states. So if you want to have regular availability to supply to buyers in, let's say, Europe or USA, you can't rely on a single location which could have a drought or flood or something else. So a diversified production base, an ability to convince farmers to shift from conventional cotton to organic cotton, and then providing non-GMO seeds, the whole works. And they have been able to build up a robust production base. And now I think demand far exceeds the supply that they are able to provide. So from let's say, a 3 crore turnover about 5 to 6 years ago when we started supporting them, today they are at 40 crore this year, and they would be doing 50 plus next year. But I think they will hit the ceiling because the production capabilities are reaching a limit. So in that sense, these are the kind of places. So value addition, finding niche markets, connecting with consumers at a sustainable level, these are going to play important factors. So if we have undifferentiated products and we still want to market it to the same set of people, it's going to be difficult. So trying to find those niches is going to be the key.
You made a point, Mr. Murray, that focusing on inputs is not going to help. And we have to start from a market-first approach on what is the market opportunity, what is the niche, etc. And the case study you just shared with us talked really about, okay, here is how you identify a market opportunity, which is really in organic cotton, etc. Just for the sake of the audience, can you also talk a lot about what does focusing on inputs mean? What do inputs mean here? Maybe if you can give us an example.
So inputs means, let us say, seeds, fertilizers, growth promoters, and pesticides, plant protection. So these could broadly be the 4 things. Seeds have good margins in them. There is a possibility to make a decent profit in that, but I think the corporates have their own distribution channels for seed. So the FPO may be one more institution. Fertilizer is where the problems lie. You can get volumes, but prices are regulated, and margins could be anywhere 3 to 5 to 8%. So ultimately, if you add on all other costs, it doesn't work out. The larger profit is in pesticides and growth promoters, both these businesses. But again, I think the ability to have working capital, to stock these, to supply them on demand basis, all these are pretty difficult challenges. FPOs have been doing this fertilizer and these kind of inputs, but on the other side, where the margins are more, they haven't done much. Growth promoters and other things, again, I think, for example, organic inputs still do not have standards. So there are issues of performance, farmers trusting these things. So Those are also challenges. So that is where I think inputs business is easier to start off, but difficult to make money out of, will not offer a great future.
When we come back to what we discussed about Chetna, what do you think they are doing right for them to be able to go from 30 to 40 to 50 now, especially from a capability building and the leadership perspective, Mr. Murray?
Great question. Yeah. So they have a very decentralized organization structure. So there are farmer producer organizations of some form. I think in some states there are cooperatives, in some states there are the company formats, but empowerment is at the ground level. So a lot of things are taken care of by these institutions, and the federation, which is Chetna Organic, basically is the market-facing arm of the institution. So they are the ones who go out and get these European and other brands to build long-term partnerships. So in particularly cotton, I think is a kind of a sensitive commodity where the risks of contamination, the risks of misstatement about it being organic, these are all issues. And these have been taken care of in such a way that I think today, globally also, Chetna Organic as a brand is trusted to be the most reliable supplier of organic cotton globally. And that I think is built on community institutions, systems and processes on the ground, documentation of things, and building people's institutions on the ground.
I want to build on what you're saying, Mr. Murray, because the kind of leadership we need to unlock global markets and brands to even manage those relationships. They are not easy relationships to manage, meet all of the industry criteria, etc. At the federation level, as you rightly said, at the Chetna Organic, is a different type of business leadership to what you talked about very usefully on the decentralized leadership, which is at the level of FPO itself, which is, as you said, building community structures, ensuring trust, quality controls. There is, I'm sure there's a lot of both community-led leadership that has to be done and production quality ensuring and all of that to be done. What type of, in your experience, what type of leadership profiles do we need? Is it that the federation is usually led better by people who have some experience in mainstream industry, value chains, etc., and are typically coming from a professional background? And can farmers be trained to become leaders of these FPOs? And maybe I'm stereotyping it here, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on what type of people and profiles and talent do you think is necessary at both of these levels, both at the federation and at the level of FPO?
General, what we could say is that too much of a corporate approach doesn't really work.
Got it.
So it is more about building relationships between end consumers and producers. So I'm not sure whether it's more Europe or it's universal, but even the end users are not looking for big hype or a very corporate approach to things. So that is a kind of connect that they have built with these European brands. And probably it would be difficult to make this as prescriptive and say this is how it should be. But we have not had high-profile corporate professionals, but we have had people who have been able to deliver results through trust and fair play and delivering on what is promised. And that, I think, has worked in this space.
What would a high-quality FPO leadership look like for you? So what sort of skills and traits do you think they should have? And let's assume we are talking about a really high-quality A+ FPO leadership. What are qualities that you're expecting in them?
A top-quality FPO leader is one that, where the organization excels or performs even in the absence of the leadership. So the leadership is very much there, but is still not overpowering or over visible. So it has empowered people across the institution to be able to perform their roles. And this includes, let's say, the professional management, the field staff. So everybody feels that they have clarity about what they're doing. They are empowered to do what they do, and they have the freedom to do what they do. And the board just does the oversight of things. So that is where I think a good leadership comes, and where the leaders are present to deal with the external world mostly, not with the internal institutional arrangements. So when it comes to negotiating with markets, negotiating with lenders, this is where you see the leadership making its presence. So some of the other qualities that we see is a dispersed leadership, or let's say a leadership which is not too centralized, is a good thing. So if there's just one man who is defined as, although technically there is a board, one or two persons determine or take a call on everything, that may not be the best thing. So a board that feels that it is participative, decision making is dispersed. The second is of rotational leadership again. So where leadership has the depth to be able to have a second line of people who can take charge over a period of time from the present leadership. So the rotational side of leadership is one thing. Third is, again, a participative board. So in most FPOs, you see that there is a 2 or 3 active directors and the rest are dormant. But in a good board, you find more of participation and decision making, more of accountability, more of ownership also. So these qualities are very much visible over there. Particularly, I think when the peak operation seasons of business come, that is when you see the board's presence and activity. So their ability to be there and get things done when the business is at its peak, when things are moving. And that is when, you have commodities moving, you have money moving, you have all the risks and everything. And that is where leadership drives organizations towards success.
You're sort of really enabling the organization to grow even in your absence rather than purely shadowed by your presence. And this type of leadership, Mr. Murray, in mainstream companies itself is also hard to find today. It's good quality leaders like these are hard to find. In your experience, do you think we have sufficient supply of leaders who can become this today? Is supply a constraint? I think we will actually not even have a fertile supply.
Supply is not the issue. The issue is also of the promoting institutions not willing to challenge societal conventions and other things. There are these castes, there are these power structures and all these in the village or in rural India. If we just want to be following that and building another institution, nothing much will change. Unless we confront that, I think it's going to be a big challenge. And these are, let me tell you, not government institutions. So it is not necessary for us to again have the same political or other kind of people taking a call on this. But unfortunately, I think even promoting institutions or trying to set up these FPOs fall into that trap. And then we are in the same rut. But where we are able to deal with this and empower, we're not displacing power structures. We're empowering the others who are otherwise, who are otherwise overshadowed. Things change. And this, I think, is possible only from an external force dealing with it. Internal structures within the rural institutions may not be able to do it, but if they are supported by these external agencies, transformations happen. And we've seen, actually, I think, a large number of young people emerging, going back to villages, having not much else to do. They are the future leaders whom we have to catch. Their relevance is suddenly forgotten. So when we say the farmer, we look at the father. We forget the son and the daughter.
This is a fascinating point, Mr. Murray. I was having a conversation recently that we are trying to bring ideas from management and structures, and I suppose something that you highlighted earlier, formal markets and informal settings, which need a certain type of operating structures, but the underlying social structures have their own challenges and their own, dynamics in some form on terms of how caste works, who can speak in a meeting, who cannot, who owns what, who's entitled to what, and so on. And if you're expecting an internal restructuring of those dynamics for the external reality to sort of play out, it's going to take a long time. It's probably never going to happen because a lot of social capital is built into these structures, which people use in whatever form. And there is a sort of tension between the formal structures we want to establish on top of these informal and fairly well entrenched social structures that are being there for such a long time, isn't it? And I think understanding that is a challenge. I mean, the answer, as you said, maybe that external entities have to come and put the pressure to be able to do this, or maybe there are other ways. But even acknowledging that challenge, I think, is going to be very, very important.
Speaking from working on the ground long years, we assume that these are difficult to change more than what it's actually possible. So the possibilities of transformation very much exist, but the ability for us as external change agents to make it happen, we need to work harder.
I always love an optimist, Mr. Murray. So I love talking to you because clearly you're bringing that sense of solutions are possible. I'm one of them too. So let's move there. If you can maybe tell us about what is already happening around capability building of farmer producer organizations. What are some of the initiatives that are being done, government, markets, otherwise? I think that'll be great to hear as well.
So a lot is being invested by the government into this FPO sector since the recent past. If we say NABARD also as part of government, so a lot of resources have gone into capacity building, into establishing these institutions, into creating some degree of infrastructure, and all this has happened. What needs to be done is, of course, a multiple of that, but the only thing, again, the question that arises is close to 60% of the program budgets are on other than the ultimate institution. 30 or 35% of the budget actually is for the FPOs. The rest is for these intermediary institutions to do capacity building, management, monitoring, and all these things. So, which is not very wrong. I think globally also that's a decent percentage to build on. But are these being done in the right way is a question. What is the quality of human resources that are delivering these? Are they working towards sustainability beyond project period? These are all and who are these people doing it? Again, if we see, multinational consulting organizations, are they best suited to take on these roles? These are the questions that continue to confront us. On the capacity building side, I think quite a bit of good work has been done in terms of building manuals and training programs, workshops, and these. So the problem with capacity building probably is to integrate it with operations. So integrating capacity building with the operations, doing it in a phased manner, interlinking it with outcomes and results. So these have not so much been there. I'm not complaining, but compared to, having worked with, let us say, NDDB or with the SHE program, where capacity building directly can be identified with outcomes. So here we don't see that relationship very distinctively, and therefore I think there are scope to rework on this.
One of the things that we've been discussing internally at Sattva is how do we take a life cycle approach towards capability building, capacity building of farmer producer organizations as well, because they're probably at different stages at different times, and the kind of inputs they need at different stages will be different. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that, and is that something that's possible and be done?
It is the way to go forward. The initial will have to be, why an FPO? Why do you need to come together? And those rationales have to be built in. And the second of empowering, or let's say building confidence that they can do it. So the initial phases will have to be around that clarity of why at all this institution required. Second, how you can manage it yourself. And in all these, I think there is the softer side of the capacity building, and there is the other hard side of it about processes, rules, regulations, compliance, organization structures. So trying to blend these two is the important thing. And if we can build the energy around coming together, the other thing happens, especially among women FPOs. We need not tell them too much about bookkeeping, reconciliation, and all that. They appreciate that once they know why they've come together and what they have to do. And as we evolve in these institutions, you can go to higher levels of capacity building. In mature organizations that we have worked with, including to the extent of negotiating with the market, women FPOs have been able to do it very effectively. When we come to things like processing, technology, I think technical support is required, and where guidance helps. But their ability to visualize and transform their own lives, there is enough evidence that I have seen, and I think you get excited by watching the growth as it happens.
Current funding or the capital that is focused on building farmer producer organization capability is a project-based funding approach. 3 years, why don't you do this? You will get to this point. So a lot of the incentives for the providers is to ensure that those 3 years capital capacity building is happening well, not as much that it is being sustainable. Second, you also talked briefly about the kind of organizations that are doing this, who are the way, the nature of these organizations, the way they're structured. If I had to ask you, what is the right form of capital we need to build capability of nonprofits? Because in startups, the people who build the capabilities of startups are investors, which means their returns are actually tied to the future growth of the organization. So almost automatically startups actually start to grow and build internal process and so on. But in FPO, since it's very program-based funding and for many reasons, is there an ideal type of capital that will actually help build the right type of capacity building models for FPOs?
Difficult to say, but I think in terms of financial resources, particularly for the FPOs, it is falling short. So we need to strengthen that part. Let me give a small illustration. The amount of work that a director of an FPO does, if he's serious about his interest in an FPO, is not compensated. And it is so valuable. You can't attach a price to it. So really, how do we make good recompense for what services they provide is a question. And capital for FPOs has to be strengthened. I think farmers contributing towards initial capital is a high expectation, may not happen, and that has to be met from somewhere else. Now, these are, I think, public good. All said and done, FPOs are public good, and therefore the state has a major role to play. In terms of the kind of financial budgets, the money that is being invested into this program, it is not significantly large. If you say that like a startup, who is going to harvest the gains of this if and when they come? Now the gains will largely, I think, go to the members of it as well as to society at large. Therefore, funding will have to come, probably blending credit and equity funding, with the state playing a dominant role, as I see. Will continue to play a dominant role.
This is a bit of a provocative question, Mr. Murray. And again, I'm simplifying this when I say this. Maybe the problem actually is the capital, which is the root cause. If the right capital comes in, do you think there are incentives for FPOs to organize the right type of leaders to come and join them and for them to be able to mature effectively? And is there a need for us to maybe actively look at what type of capital can be unlocked for us in addition to just looking at how quality of capacity building can be improved?
The capacity to absorb and manage capital is there with about 10 to 20% of FPOs. So we will have to pick those up and put them on a higher growth path. And for those, capital provisions will have to be made in a larger quantum. Because these are state programs, equity becomes an issue. And therefore, there is a uniform regulation saying everyone will be eligible for these quantums. So as some of these demonstrate their capacity to manage capital, they need to be taken and dealt with at another scale altogether.
Absolutely. And I think it ties back to the life cycle approach that you brought up as well, that calibrating a capacity building approach to different parts of the life cycle and being able to look at what type of capacity building support and what type of capital is required at each stage of the life cycle. I think that is probably at the core of being able to build this effectively at scale.
Right. So is capital constraining growth of this program? If you ask that question, debt capital at this time is scarce. Then the capacity of these institutions to manage debt and to service debt is also a challenge. So just opening it up and providing may not solve the problem. For those that have reached a stage where they're hungry for capital, then this debt equity ratio and all these should not apply. We will have to use alternative metrics of taking them onto the next level of growth. And that is where I think regulatory constraints, the structure which is built, has its own limitations in being able to deal with higher demand which comes.
Yeah. The access to capital is limited because the absorption of capital is low. Absorption of capital is low because the access to capital is limited. So it sort of is a self-perpetuating challenge.
We are reaching a stage where we're breaking out of that cycle, and close to 20% of FPOs are showing signs of growth where they would get commercial very quickly. And that is where I think regulations and laws also have to keep pace with that and treat these like corporates, not like cooperatives.
I want to go back to something you said very, very early in the conversation. Bring it back right now, Mr. Murray. And then I have a couple of questions after that. But we started by talking about the difference between production and market linkages. And as we were discussing that, you gave us this example of Chetna Organic and how they looked at the organic cotton market. And it's a niche space. They were able to play here and then they are able to differentiate themselves. If you look at the universe of farmer producer organizations, there is going to be a large share of them that are going to only focus on staple material. They're not going to differentiate on market opportunity. They're just going to do the usual, sell it at low premium, have lower margins. Their top lines are okay, bottom lines are what they're going to be. And then there are going to be some, FPOs that are going to differentiate on a very unique and niche market opportunity, like organic cotton. It could be other things and so on. In let's say 5 years from now, if you look at the universe, do you feel like what percentage of them will continue to stay in the staple-based approach, low margins, a decent top line, to how many of them are going to be Chetna Organics, which are actually identifying niche market opportunities? And the reason I'm asking, and I'll just add this, is market differentiation a constraint as well? Saying a large part of our agriculture is actually non-differentiated staple produce. So most FPOs are going to be there. So in case you had to answer the percentage question, what is your general sense? I'd love to hear whether that's a...
What we've seen is the presence of an FPO in a market resets the rules of the game. Resets. So you find that even if we are in a commodity like soybean, because we operate differently, right from, let us say, sieving the soybean to bagging it, to testing the soil moisture content in it, to weighing it, In all these operations, when you are transparent and ethical, you could return up to 9% more to a farmer. So that itself, resets the rules of the game. And even if we do 10% of the market, the fact that you are there as a last resort for a farmer helps the whole market to return better value to the producer. And that is where I think timely payment, all these things, are undervalued when we do comparison with the trader. And if these are done, they themselves could be right up to even the processor prefers to deal with an FPO because he knows that he's sure of what the quality is on paper is what he's getting. So he's willing to deal with it. So these have been the things, but these require a lot of hard work. Expectations of farmers are also unreasonable. Trying to do these things is not easy. And then trying to document and demonstrate it is the game, which some have done and shown that it makes a hell of a difference.
I want to touch upon the last point that you made, and I think we've touched upon it multiple times in different ways, which is you said NGOs are enabling farmer-producer organizations. NGOs themselves are not market-facing organizations. We also talked about how global players may not be the right person. In your experience and in your wisdom, who would be an ideal capability building partner for an FPO? What sort of traits, qualities, skills should they bring to the table?
It will have to be a combination of the two. And I think even where we are talking about these large consulting firms bagging these contracts, ultimately they are relying on people who have prior experience working in this space. One space I think which we should recognize is that in the 80s and 90s, a lot of young professionals with a lot of ideals went on to set up large number of institutions like Pradhan, Basics, and these kinds of organizations. They would actually be the ideal ground or the entities who can promote robust institutions. So we see some like Aga Khan Rural Support Program, or some of these are the ideal mix of bringing professional approaches with a human touch, and combining these two, trying to deliver on results. So that generation, unfortunately, is a fading generation. So as I see, Gram Vikas and some of these organizations, so they would be probably the ideal vehicles to implement programs like this.
I wanted to touch upon two cross-cutting themes and FPO capability building, Mr. Murray. And one you touched upon already, and the one I think we haven't spoken about, but I wanted to get your views on this. One is the role of gender. I recently was in a meeting where I asked people to close their eyes and imagine a farmer. And I asked them how many of them imagined a man. The entire room had imagined a man as a farmer. Despite us knowing the fact that more women are in the field than men, our understanding and articulation of farmers and agriculture is from a lens of men. When we think about FPO capability building, you touched upon how sometimes it's an advantage to have women because they intuitively understand a few things better. So I'd love to have you share your thoughts around this idea of gender. Is there something we should do more to promote more women-led, women-based farmer-producer organizations?
Right. Yeah. So a little distraction or diversion from there. This self-help group movement has divided the country across by gender. And unfortunately, forgotten the men. And that has had its own adverse impact, like it or not. And in FPOs, probably we need to solve that by having mixed gender FPOs. Women only FPOs, do have them, but try and mainstream women also into FPO programs. So where again, I will say we haven't seen too many, but where leadership has been handed over to women, they have done a phenomenal job in many FPOs. In terms of discipline, in terms of processes, they are very tough. So we need to solve this problem by looking, I think, probably as household as a unit of production and not a man and woman. So we'll have to relook at that. And we also need to bring in the next generation into the thinking process. So even if the man is the member of the FPO, the women and the children also have to, in a way, be recognized as co-participants in this movement or in this program. And that is the way I think we'll have to address this issue. It's not easy, but it's not complex. I can say that.
The other cross-cutting trend I wanted to talk about, and I haven't heard much about this, so maybe it's, I'd love to hear your thoughts, is this entire focus on climate change right now and the FPO capability building. I think if anything, there is probably greater urgency right now to be able to have aggregated structures. But in your discourse and the conversations you're having, do you see these two conversations coming together, which is the focus on climate change and the focus on farmer producer organizations and their capability building?
There is convergence on these two. At a production level, for example, the Chetana story that we were talking about, farmers, if we go and meet them, talk about changing patterns, weather patterns, rainfall or everything. So they are also worried or concerned about these things on the ground. But then they feel that these are too large issues for managing at a village level or a micro level. Can these be controlled at the small unit level? These global changes is one question. So how do we deal with it? What do we do to mitigate those is there. And I think people are open to doing it and recognize that these are problems to be dealt with. Things like, let us say, water conservation and some of these measures which are there, people are adopting or willing to do if provided the right guidance and resources are extended. But on the ground, certainly communities are worried about the changes that are happening over time and are willing to do something about it if they are offered solutions.
And it's great that a lot of times some of these problems are understood top down. It sort of seems like, everybody is worried, not the person on the ground. Here it's actually the other way around. I think the farmers are able to see their problems directly. It's the enabling structure on the top, which is, I think, missing today, which I think we need to work on, which is a great point. Sort of leads me to the last question I had for you, Mr. Murray. You've been extremely kind, a lot of fantastic insights. In terms of tangible recommendations on what we need to work on, and it'll be great to hear your thoughts at what they call the Samaj Sarkar Bazaar level. So at a Sarkar level, policy related changes, what would you recommend? B, at a Bazaar level, are they market related models, private sector playing a role, credit and finance markets playing a role? And at a Samaj level, what can community organizations do differently? What can enabling organizations do differently? It'd be great to hear your thoughts at all the three levels, Mr. Murray.
So at the government level, probably the very design of this FPC is having its own limitations. So in a way, it is a company, in another way, it is a collective, and the cost of establishment, the cost of compliances are tremendous. And these are killing these institutions, and that needs to be addressed. Everyone recognizes that. We have to solve that problem to some extent. From the bazaar perspective, blended capital, or what we call patient capital, is what is required in this space. So private capital of a nature like impact investors and others who have clarity about why they are wanting to get into the space, have the patience to deal with it, and a willingness to wait. So it will be a longer term investment. This will have to be blended with grant and other kinds of support so that it is possible to have catalytic capital working for the long term. So bringing the professionalism of the private sector and the advantages of the state and the social sector, if we can combine these two in a way that capital flows outside of the state sector also into these spaces, that will be great. It's a possibility. Someone has to sit down and work on it and find how it has to be done. And that requires some thinking. On the community side, again, I think equally, FPO should not be seen as cure-alls or prescriptive to communities. There's this whole idea of every village, one FPO. All sorts of things are being done. So for a community, the rationale and the need and the advantages of an FPO have to be clearly understood before putting the first brick of the foundation of these institutions. If we build an edifice without clarity on that, it will not sustain. So these institutions have to be people's institutions. Work with people, let them understand that these are the needs. Then we start building on this. Let's not go into this whole high-speed 10,000 FPO kind of model. It is not going to go anywhere. It will crash. So people have to be at the center of the program, and they should understand and acknowledge and realize the relevance and need for these institutions, and then only we should move forward. But on the ground, certainly communities are worried about the changes that are happening over time and are willing to do something about it if they are offered solutions.
This is very, very helpful, Mr. Murray, and I think very tangible points. You're absolutely right that there is a little bit of maybe euphoria is too strong, but there's an excitement around, hey, we found this one thing that will solve all problems type of a thinking for FPOs. And I think tempering that enthusiasm, not focusing on purely just increasing quantity, but building quality and the strengths, I think is going to be very, very important. This has been a fascinating conversation, Mr. Murray. I've thoroughly enjoyed our discussion. I think we've covered a lot of ground, a lot of perspectives. And for me, one of the beautiful things about the conversation was also that we were able to look at this problem from a lens of social structures, finance, opportunities on the ground, and so on, and also a larger, broader policy perspective. You've been very, very kind with your time and your insights. Thank you so much. I deeply, deeply enjoyed speaking to you today.
I stand by whatever I say, and I'm ready to be accountable for everything that I have said. And I think people can come back and ask questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
You have been listening to Decoding Impact. To learn more about Sattva and Sattva Knowledge Institute, please explore sattva.co.in. We invite you to like, share, and subscribe to Decoding Impact so you never miss out on new episodes. Thank you for joining us.